Tonight, I want to share news of a quiet earthquake, one that arrived late in the workday Wednesday and was largely drowned out by the noise surrounding border negotiations and confirmation hearings. Still, it shouldn't be dismissed. What took place in a seventh-floor conference room at the Internal Revenue Service headquarters marks the first time in modern American history that a sitting IRS commissioner has publicly refused a direct White House demand for resignation. Constitutional scholars describe this as among the clearest confrontations yet between executive overreach and institutional independence. At a glance, this could be mistaken for another bureaucratic spat, routine Washington friction between political appointees and career officials. But this was never about one administrator's job security. It's about whether the nation's tax collection apparatus can remain independent of presidential whim. What follows will uncover the parts of this episode most people haven't seen, why the White House became so intent on removing Danny Werfel from his position, why Werfel responded with such defiance, and why the IRS, an institution that has frequently bent to political pressure throughout its history, finally decided this was the line that could not be crossed. At a glance, this could be mistaken for a personnel dispute. Another headline that reads something like, "Administration seeks leadership change at federal agency." But this was never about management preferences or policy disagreements. It's about the systematic dismantling of checks on executive power. What follows will uncover why the White House became fixated on installing a loyalist at the helm of America's tax enforcement machinery, why Commissioner Werfel recognized this demand as fundamentally different from normal political transitions, and why career IRS officials, people who typically avoid public confrontation at all costs, stood united behind their leader's refusal. To understand how we arrived at this moment, the sequence of events matters. Roughly 6 weeks ago, shortly after the administration announced sweeping changes to executive branch ethics rules, senior White House advisors began what insiders describe as a pressure campaign targeting the IRS. It started with seemingly routine requests for briefings on ongoing audits of high-net-worth individuals and corporations. Those requests, according to former IRS officials familiar with the matter, went far beyond normal oversight. They demanded specifics about taxpayers by name, details about enforcement strategies, and timelines for concluding investigations. When Werfel declined to provide information that would violate taxpayer privacy protections enshrined in federal law, the White House escalated. What followed went far beyond administrative friction. The objective was total control of tax enforcement, the ability to shield allies and weaponize audits against perceived enemies. At exactly 2:47 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday, Werfel received what witnesses describe as an ultimatum delivered through the Treasury Secretary's office. The message was clear and direct. Submit a resignation letter by close of business Wednesday, or face termination for cause. Court documents obtained by investigative journalists reveal the White House had prepared detailed accusations of management failures and resistance to necessary reforms as justification for removal. Legal experts note these charges mirror the playbook used to purge inspectors general and other watchdog officials who refused to comply with directives that violated their statutory mandates. Werfel's response arrived at 4:15 p.m. Wednesday in a 6-page letter addressed to the president and simultaneously released to congressional oversight committees. The language was measured but unmistakable in its defiance. "I was appointed to a 5-year term specifically to insulate this agency from political interference," Werfel wrote. "That protection exists not for my benefit, but to ensure that every American taxpayer can trust that enforcement decisions are based on law, not political favor. I will not resign under threat, and I will not subordinate my statutory responsibilities to preserve my position." The letter went further, documenting what Werfel characterized as increasingly brazen attempts to influence ongoing investigations. He detailed requests for information about audits involving entities with direct financial ties to the president's family business interests. He described pressure to reassign career investigators working on cases involving major campaign donors. He outlined demands that the IRS expedite tax-exempt status applications for organizations that federal law enforcement agencies had flagged as potential conduits for foreign influence operations. Put plainly, this amounted to a systematic attempt to convert the Internal Revenue Service into a political weapon and a shield for corruption. At this point, the behavior moved beyond ethical violations and into potential obstruction of justice territory. That shift is precisely what veteran prosecutors identified when reviewing the timeline. After examining the sequence of White House demands, the pattern became clear. Each pressure point corresponded to a specific enforcement action that threatened politically sensitive targets. The so-called efficiency review of IRS operations was never meant to be conducted by management consultants or efficiency experts. Instead, the plan involved installing a White House-selected transition team with direct access to taxpayer files, audit strategies, and enforcement priorities. Documents show this team would have routing authority over approximately $12 billion in annual enforcement operations, effectively determining which cases proceeded and which quietly disappeared. This financial architecture explains the White House's desperation to remove Werfel. Career prosecutors reviewing the commissioner's letter determined that the documented interference attempts constitute potential violations of federal statutes protecting the independence of tax administration. The pattern undermines constitutional principles of equal treatment under law and, more fundamentally, breaches the sacred compact between citizens and their government that enforcement will be blind to political connections. The Treasury Department's language was notably cautious, a marked departure from its typical deference to White House directives. In a statement released Thursday morning, Treasury emphasized that the IRS commissioner serves a statutory term established by Congress to ensure continuity and independence in tax administration. The $12 billion at stake in annual enforcement operations is more than budget authority. It is the mechanism through which tax law applies equally to billionaires and working families alike. It represents the principle that wealth and political access cannot purchase immunity from legal obligations, which brings us to congressional Republicans themselves. For much of the past year, GOP lawmakers have twisted themselves into knots, defending what would once have been indefensible expansions of executive power. They've justified firing inspectors general, defended interference with law enforcement, and dismissed concerns about conflicts of interest as partisan hysteria. So, what shifted? Why did 7 Republican senators, including members of the Finance Committee with direct oversight of the IRS, issue a joint statement supporting Werfel's right to serve his full statutory term? It had nothing to do with a newfound commitment to institutional independence or rule of law. The real reason is self-interest and political calculation. These senators represent states where major corporations and wealthy constituents depend on predictable, rules-based tax enforcement. When word spread through Washington's legal and accounting networks that the White House sought to install loyalists who would make audit decisions based on political favor rather than tax code, it triggered alarm among the business establishment. Major donors made clear their concern that a politicized IRS would create unpredictable enforcement, making tax planning impossible and exposing corporations to arbitrary treatment. In Washington, authority rests as much on perception as position. When the Business Roundtable and U.S. Chamber of Commerce quietly signaled opposition to Werfel's removal, it sent an unmistakable message. Even Republican senators couldn't afford to be seen endorsing the conversion of tax enforcement into a presidential protection racket. This episode marks one of the clearest signs yet that institutional resistance to authoritarian encroachment remains possible. It's among the first real indications that career officials, backed by statutory protections and bipartisan support for basic governmental function, can still say no to unlawful orders. Still, it would be reckless to underestimate the danger ahead. The cultural consequences are equally significant. The White House targeted the IRS because it understands a simple but powerful truth: control the tax collector, and you control accountability itself. The ability to shield allies from enforcement while directing audits toward critics represents perhaps the most direct route to consolidating power in a system that still maintains the forms of democracy. This administration's goal was to overwrite decades of painstaking reforms built on bipartisan recognition that presidents from both parties had abused IRS authority. With a system rooted in personal loyalty, selective enforcement, and protection for the connected few, the IRS may have stopped this particular takeover attempt, but it cannot end the larger struggle for independent institutions. That battle is playing out in the Justice Department, where the White House has demanded prosecutors seek approval for investigations involving the president's associates. It's happening at the Federal Reserve, where officials describe mounting pressure to adjust interest rate decisions to favor short-term political goals over long-term economic stability. It's occurring across inspectors' general offices, where watchdogs face termination threats for pursuing corruption cases involving administration officials. The attempt to seize control of tax enforcement was merely the most visible tip of the iceberg. This is not about tax policy or administrative efficiency. This is about whether power can still be constrained by law. And let this serve as a clear message to those in power. We are watching the appointments. We are watching the pressure campaigns. We are watching every attempt to convert independent agencies into instruments of personal protection. We will not allow the institutions that safeguard equal treatment under law to be liquidated piece by piece for private gain. Still, it would be reckless to underestimate the danger ahead. A president who feels cornered by mounting legal exposure, embarrassed by public defiance from a civil servant, and frustrated that traditional levers of power won't bend to his will is not a diminished threat. This White House has never accepted institutional resistance quietly. The administration doesn't interpret statutory protections for agency independence as lawful constraints on authority. It interprets them as obstacles to be overcome or destroyed. The next 72 hours matter. With direct removal of Verfel now politically untenable and congressional oversight committees signaling they'll investigate any retaliation, the White House's options for controlling IRS enforcement have narrowed considerably. Pressure shapes behavior, and when conventional paths to institutional capture are blocked and political cover for open defiance of statutory protections evaporates, attention inevitably shifts toward less visible mechanisms of control. Watch for budget maneuvers designed to starve enforcement divisions of resources. Expect strategic leaks of partial information about ongoing audits, calculated to create public pressure for cases to be dropped. Anticipate the sudden transfer of career investigators away from sensitive cases, replacements selected for their willingness to slow-walk politically inconvenient enforcement. Which brings us back to the warning about agency appropriations bills. As conventional routes to installing loyalists close, expect sharper turns toward budgetary pressure that could paralyze enforcement without requiring Senate-confirmed appointees. Desperation doesn't retreat, it adapts. We may also witness emergency executive orders claiming new authority over inefficient government operations, midnight reassignments of career staff to field offices thousands of miles from their cases, or leaked allegations designed to undermine public confidence in IRS leadership. Today's defiance represents a clear win for the rule of law and institutional independence, but it also raises the stakes. It increases the temptation to pursue enforcement paralysis through methods that avoid the public confrontation that proved so costly this week. To the citizens who have felt powerless, watching institutions bend and sometimes break under relentless political pressure, I want to speak directly. I know how easy it is to feel like the safeguards designed to protect us are failing. I know the disillusionment of seeing career professionals forced from office, watching oversight mechanisms dismantled, witnessing the slow erosion of checks on executive power. But look at what has occurred this week. Look at the scoreboard. an IRS commissioner, refused an unlawful demand and kept his position. 7 Republican senators broke with the White House to support institutional independence. The business community signaled that even political allies have limits when their own interests are threatened by arbitrary enforcement. Yes, the struggle for accountable government continues, and yes, the threats to institutional integrity remain severe, but the institution still functions. Career officials still possess the courage to say no. That should remind us that if the Internal Revenue Service can be defended against political capture, so too can the larger architecture of accountable government itself. We cannot safeguard one agency while ignoring broader threats to institutional independence. Across the Justice Department, regulatory agencies, and oversight bodies, the principle of decisions based on law rather than political favor must guide us. Every citizen deserves a government that applies rules equally regardless of wealth or political connections. Those representatives who stood firm against this particular overreach must show the same courage across all arenas of governance. And let this serve as a clear message to those in power. We are watching the appointments. We are watching the appropriations. We are watching every pressure campaign and every attempt to install loyalists in positions of independent authority. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires active participation, constant vigilance, and courage from every one of us to defend the institutions that make equal justice possible. If this breakdown helped cut through the noise and explain what's truly at stake when career officials resist political pressure, consider subscribing. Sustaining reporting that prioritizes institutional analysis over partisan talking points is essential during moments like this. I'd like to hear how you see it. Do you believe statutory protections for agency independence can still constrain executive overreach, or have we reached a point where only political consequences matter? Let me know in the comments below.